The morning light in Rome arrived not simply as a promise, but as an ancient contract. It was the spring of 79 BCE, and you, an innocent child of 10, sat on the cool marble slabs of your family's villa courtyard, just beyond the bustle of the city, but still within its presence. Sunbeams filtered through tall columns, lighting patterns on the stone where your dolls lay abandoned. You invented games of invisible armies and invisible gods, your laughter echoing lightly until the day turned quiet. Your mother, draped in fine wool, hummed softly as she wove thread after thread, her fingers moving as if guided by a memory you had not yet learned to share. Your father's deep voice floated down from the portico. He spoke in low, serious tones with merchants about grain shipments, debts, the politics of the Senate. For a moment it all felt safe and normal, just another day in Rome, but then a shift. A sound came up the street, slow and certain, horns, not playful, not musical. They were ceremonial, heavy, the kind of horns that halts laughter and stills hearts. People emerged from their houses, neighbors paused in their tasks, servants stopped in the doorways. A hush fell. And then you saw him, the Pontifex Maximus, the highest priest of Rome, walking through the neighborhood. His entourage surrounded him, men in crimson cloaks, sandals striking the pavement in perfect rhythm. No smiles, no greetings. His eyes scanned. They moved methodically from face to face, child to child, lingering as though assessing worth. You kept your doll close and crouched behind your mother's robes. Your mother's hand touched your shoulder, but did not pull you away. You could sense her tension. The priest's eyes turned your way. The world slowed. The sun's warmth seemed distant. The columns, the courtyard, they were still, but you were not. Time stretched. Then, quiet as a tomb, the priest raised his staff, a gesture you now understand to have been final. His voice broke the stillness, cold, clear, deliberate. This one belongs to the goddess. You heard it as a single sentence, though it felt like a sentence of chains. Your mother collapsed. Her breath left her in a gasp. She clutched her chest, tears streaming free. Your father, he stiffened as though struck. He knew. He knew exactly what refusal would mean. Not just for you, but for all of you. You did not yet understand. You only heard the words chosen, honor. They sounded beautiful, but you felt them like stones, and in that moment your child world ended. You learned that the early morning sun, the marble slab, the playful doll, they all belonged to a life that was already gone. The ritual of selection, so much spoken about as a blessing, was in truth a sentence. A contract written in laws you had no voice to sign. The girl selected, girl of 10, would now owe 30 years of service. 30 years under vow. 30 years in a golden prison. A child taken from her home. The gods were watching, the city was safe, the flame eternal, but you were neither safe nor free. You glanced at your mother's face. Grief was there, rage too, but it did little to stop what was coming. When they led you away, you did not resist. You were too young. You were stunned. The courtyard, your villa, your father's discussions, all faded behind you. You stepped into the carriage, the city's heartbeat drumming in your ears. Your mother's tears stained your memory. Your father's silence pressed on you like a weight. You held your doll tight, but even that comfort slipped from your grasp. Inside the carriage, you saw the white robes of the priestesses, the polished stones of the temple courtyard, the gardens shimmering. It looked beautiful. So beautiful you almost believed in the honor again. You did not yet know what awaited, what rules, what punishments, what isolation. You did not yet know how the flame would become your jailer, but you knew this: you would never be home again. Your name would be erased. You no longer belonged to father or mother, only to the state, to the goddess, to the ritual. You were chosen, and that word, chosen, would come to feel like a lie. For it meant you were lost. So the journey began. Not with fanfare, not with celebration, but with a hush, a change, a selection. And you, once a child of 10, were swept into a vast machine of ritual and terror, disguised as holiness. The sun shone still, the columns rose tall, the marble was cool, but for you the world had shifted. The innocent courtyard became the threshold of something far darker. They gave you a new name, but it wasn't really a name. It was a title. You were no longer Livia, daughter of Cassius. That girl no longer existed. From the moment you entered the gates of the Temple of Vesta, your identity was scrubbed clean like soot from a marble floor. You were now simply a Vestal, a sacred vessel, property of the state. The past didn't matter. Your family didn't matter, and soon you would learn not to think of them at all. The House of the Vestals was the most beautiful building you had ever seen. Towering marble pillars reached into the sky like arms pleading for mercy. Fountains sparkled in the sun, and the garden smelled of jasmine and rosemary. It was too perfect, too clean, too silent. Beauty, you learned quickly, was a trap. It lulled you into believing everything was safe, gentle, holy. But beneath every polished stone was control. The first night was the hardest. They stripped you of your tunic and gave you the white robe of the goddess. Rougher, heavier. It felt strange on your skin. You didn't sleep. None of the new girls did. You lay on a marble bench in the cold dormitory, eyes open, staring into the dark, afraid to even move. If you cried, you did it in silence, because the walls had ears. And the older priestesses were always listening. In the days that followed, your education began. But this was no ordinary learning. You weren't taught to grow into yourself. You were taught to disappear. There were 3 sacred rules carved into your soul like the words on a gravestone. First, virginity always, not just physically but in thought, in presence. A glance could be judged improper. A smile could be dangerous. Second, absolute obedience. The Pontifex Maximus and the senior Vestals were not just leaders. They were voices of the gods. Their word was law, and law was life. Third, protect the sacred flame. That flickering fire, burning endlessly inside the temple's heart, represented Rome itself. If it died, so did Rome's favor with the gods. And if you were near it when it died, it would be your life they took next. You were 10. You still dreamed of dolls and games. But those dreams faded quickly under the weight of fear, because the punishments came fast. A mistake didn't need to be real. It only had to be suspected. And even suspicion was enough to send a girl into silence. You saw it with your own eyes. A girl named Marcia, just 2 years older than you, was dragged from morning prayers by 2 senior Vestals. No one said why. No one explained. You never saw her again. But later you found a bloodstain behind the chapel doors. The marble had been scrubbed, but not well enough. That's when you realized holy places can be full of pain. Everything you did was watched. Every step, every word. You could not eat without ritual. You could not bathe without permission. Even the letters you tried to send to your mother were censored, rewritten, sometimes never delivered. When she wrote back, her words were broken, confused, edited by someone else's hand. It was like speaking to a ghost. You began to forget her face. The older Vestals taught you to smile during rituals, to move gracefully through processions, to chant the prayers with steady voices. But behind their faces was emptiness. You looked into their eyes and saw nothing there, just silence, just duty. They weren't women anymore. They were marble statues that had learned to breathe, and so you learned too, to speak only when asked. To never look directly at the Pontifex. To step precisely, bow deeply, smile politely. You learned to erase yourself before anyone else could do it for you. And slowly it worked. Your memories faded. You stopped asking about home. You stopped crying at night. You didn't even flinch when the guards inspected your chamber at midnight. You were becoming what they wanted. Somewhere deep inside, a small part of you still remembered sunlight on your face and your mother's hands weaving wool. But that part grew quieter every day, and in its place grew something colder, more rigid. You told yourself it was honor. They told you it was destiny, but you knew in the pit of your stomach that it was a kind of death. A death with no grave, no funeral, just a transformation into someone else. A perfect, silent, obedient shell, and always there was the flame, flickering, watching, waiting. The fear began slowly, like a draft under a door. You didn't notice it at first. It was just a feeling in your stomach when you walked past the sacred flame. or when the senior Vestal's eyes lingered on you a moment too long. But fear in this house did not stay small. It grew. It crept into your breath, your posture, your sleep. It wrapped around your ribs like an iron band until even silence felt dangerous. You were assigned duties long before you understood them. You swept ashes that were never allowed to fall out of place. You carried water for ritual baths that no one actually bathed in. You tended lamps that could never be allowed to flicker. Every task was simple, but every task carried threat. The rules were carved so deeply into your mind that even lifting a cup felt like holding your own fate. You learned to walk without sound, to speak without emotion. You learned to hold your breath when a priest entered the hall. And you learned something else. Something no inscription ever said aloud. Here, children were not protected. They were tested, measured, broken gently, patiently, thoroughly. The first time you saw a true punishment, you were 13, old enough to understand, young enough to never forget. The sacred flame had sputtered during the night. No one knew why or pretended not to. The pontifex arrived before dawn, robes trailing behind him like a moving shroud. His face was carved from stone. He did not shout. He did not scold. He only asked for the girl responsible. Her name was Aelia. She had tended the flame last. She was quiet, devoted, soft-spoken. You had once braided her hair before evening prayers. You thought she was safe because she always obeyed. But in this house, obedience did not matter. Mistakes, whether real or convenient, were enough. They took her to the lower chamber beneath the temple. No sunlight reached there. You were not meant to follow. But the walls were thin, and marble carries echoes. You heard it, the muffled sound of panic. Then something else, a sob, quickly silenced. Then only footsteps, heavy ones. Ritual ones. The senior Vestal told you later, in a voice calm as still water, that Aelia was receiving correction. That the rods were consecrated, that her pain was purification. You nodded because you had to. But your hands would not stop shaking. When she returned 3 days later, Aelia was not Aelia. Her back was straight, but her eyes were gone. Not blind, just empty. Her lips did not tremble, not once. Her walk was slow, careful, as though every breath hurt. And the way she sat, held stiff, as though she was holding her body together from the inside. No tears. Tears were forbidden. Even pain had to be silent. That night you could not sleep. You lay still in your hard bed, staring into the dark, feeling the world tilt. For the first time, you understood something terrible and permanent about your life here. There was no safety in goodness. There was no mercy in purity. And innocence was not protection, it was bait. After Aelia, everything changed. Not in rules, but in you. You watched every flicker of the flame, with a dread that curled your spine. You checked the oil again and again until your fingers bled from the cold metal rim. You did not breathe near it, for fear your breath alone would count as blame. You no longer dreamed of home. You dreamed of steps leading into darkness, of hands binding your wrists, of light snuffed out. Inside the temple and inside you, the senior Vestals praised discipline, but what they cultivated was fear. The kind that made you obey before being asked. The kind that hollowed you from within so thoroughly there was no room left for self. You saw it wherever you looked. Young girls barely 12, learning to stand without shaking. Some biting their lips until they bled just to keep from screaming. Others praying not for favor or blessing, but for invisibility. You learned the real meaning of holy. Not sacred, not blessed, untouchable, not precious, owned. Rome called you daughters of Vesta, protectors of the flame. But you now saw the truth. You were insurance, a living warning, a reminder to every Roman mother. Your daughter belongs to the state before she belongs to you. By 14, you no longer laughed. By 15, you no longer wept. And by 16, you had already begun to change your breathing, your voice, your very posture, not to become holy, but to become unreadable. Expression was risk. Warmth was weakness. Humanity was liability. The house no longer felt like marble halls. It felt like pressure. Beautiful walls that closed in one ritual at a time, one command at a time, one silent terror at a time. You had survived the beginning, but you had not yet seen the worst, because the rods, The bruising, silent beatings were only for mistakes. There was another fate waiting for those accused of breaking purity, not punishment, not discipline, not even death. Something colder, slower, more final. Burial, alive. The years inside the temple did not feel like years. They felt like seasons of fear passing one after another, marked not by festivals or birthdays, but by inspections, interrogations, and nights spent waiting for a footstep in the corridor that might end your life. You grew older but not freer, taller but not stronger. The temple did not raise you, it consumed you one layer at a time, until even breathing felt like obedience. By the time you were 16, you had learned the rhythm of living in captivity disguised as holiness. You rose before dawn, washed in silence, prayed in silence, ate in silence. Your hands always steady, your gaze always lowered, your voice always careful. You did not exist as a person, only as a duty. But the older you grew, the more you understood the quiet truth all Vestals eventually learned. The fire was not what Rome was protecting. Rome was protecting its power over you. The sacred flame was a symbol, yes, but a symbol built from your fear. A flame you could never look away from, because to look away was to fall under suspicion. If it so much as flickered, your pulse would thunder in your throat, certain that someone would soon vanish below into the stone chamber again. The bruises you saw on others taught you more than the priests ever did. You learned exactly how far fear could travel through a girl's body without spilling a single drop of blood. But there was a punishment worse than bruises, so terrible that no one ever dared speak of it openly. And the first time you heard the word whispered, you felt a coldness settle in your spine that never truly left you again. Incestum, impurity, defilement, violation of the vow. The word itself was like a noose. It did not require proof. It did not require witnesses. A glance, a rumor, a jealous whisper from a rival priestess, a political enemy. Any of these could become a death sentence, but not death as Rome gave to ordinary criminals. You could not be executed. You were too holy for that. So they chose something worse, burial alive. You learned about it not from a lesson, but from terror. One afternoon, a hush fell over the temple, different from ordinary silence, heavy, waiting. The bells that signaled ritual were not rung. The doors were barred. You were told to stand in the courtyard and remain still. A line of priests entered. At their center walked a girl, one you knew only by sight, Junia. She had soft eyes, gentle hands, and a way of smiling at other novices as if she still remembered something human. You had never heard her speak above a whisper. But now she walked as though she had already been carved from stone, a white veil covering her face. She did not cry. She did not plead. You realize she didn't dare. A single tear would have been treated as defiance. The senior Vestal declared her polluted. You didn't hear the accusation, only the sentence. The air around you turned thick. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. They dressed her like a bride. They placed flowers in her hair. But she was not being married to a man. She was being handed to the earth. That evening, when the novices were ordered indoors, you did not sleep. No one did. You could hear faint chanting in the distance. You could hear the city gathered, not weeping, not shouting, just watching, like spectators to a ritual slaughter dressed in silk. The next morning, there was no sign of Junia, no mention of her name, no prayer for her soul. Just absence, as if she had never walked the halls beside you. As if the dirt outside Rome had swallowed not just her body, but her story. The burial chamber was dug deep into the earth, large enough to stand inside, but not to live. A lamp, a loaf of bread, a small jug of water were left beside her. So Rome could say she had been given a chance. But you knew the truth. The lamp died first, and the darkness came before hunger. That was the moment you understood there was no version of this life that ended gently. The rods could break the body. The burial erased the person. But what terrified you most was not death. It was how quietly a girl could be erased. You looked at the other Vestals standing beside you, some blank-faced, some trembling behind rigid posture, some already hollow, and you realized something even darker. No one ever saved a Vestal. No one even tried. Rome loved purity as long as purity stayed chained, and from that day forward, whenever you saw the earth turn for planting, whenever you looked at soft soil dark with morning dew, a part of your mind whispered, "This is where they put us when we are no longer useful." For the first time, you started to wonder not if you would survive the temple, but whether survival was even the better fate. The years after Junior's disappearance did not feel like living. They felt like waiting for mistake, waiting for suspicion, waiting for the wrong breath at the wrong moment to become your undoing. You moved through the halls like a shadow wearing skin. You bowed when required, spoke when spoken to, smiled only in ritual, and slept like a prisoner who knows footsteps at midnight might mean the end. What changed most after that day was not the rules, but your mind. Before, fear was something you felt. After, fear became something you were. It lived inside you like a second heartbeat. Every sound could mean judgment. Every gaze could mean accusation. You began to shrink, not in body but in self, until you no longer knew where the illusion of holiness ended and the cage of obedience began. You learned to erase yourself carefully. You thought smaller. You breathed smaller. You hoped less. The temple didn't need chains. It bred submission, until the idea of escape no longer existed in you. The senior Vestals called this purity of spirit. You understood it as disappearance. You were 17 when you first noticed how much of you had already died quietly inside your body. One afternoon, during a ceremony, a young novice beside you dropped a small offering bowl. It shattered before it hit the floor. The sound rang through the chamber like thunder. The girl froze, horror spreading across her face. You did not gasp. You did not flinch. You felt nothing. That was when you realized the temple no longer needed to break you. You had broken yourself for them. Soon after, sleep stopped feeling like rest. You no longer dreamed of home, not because you forgot it, but because you unconsciously forced your mind never to go where longing might wake. Desire was dangerous. Memory was dangerous. Anything that reminded you of a life before obedience felt like a crack in your armor. Better to be empty than fragile. Better to be numb than afraid. Some girls coped differently. One carved prayers into her own skin beneath her sleeves, drawing lines so thin they nearly vanished when healed. Small, secret rebellions written in scars. Another whispered to herself at night, repeating ritual chants like a charm to silence nightmares. Some grew rigid with discipline, clinging to control as the only shield they had left. But you drifted inward, slowly disappearing into stillness. You became the perfect Vestal, the kind Rome glorified, calm, obedient, silent, unquestioning, and that perfection terrified you because it didn't feel holy. It felt hollow. Your smiles became ritual gestures. Your voice became a vessel for words that were never your own. Your presence became property. The world beyond the temple was fading. Markets, families, mothers laughing with daughters, those images belonged to another realm, untouchable, unreachable, like a half-remembered myth. You existed behind marble and ceremony, behind surveillance dressed as devotion. Yet the truth was always there, pulsing under the surface like a bruise. Rome had not elevated you. It had devoured you, but there was worse still to come, because captivity alone was not the end of a Vestal's story. Some girls survived 3 decades of service only to learn that survival did not mean life. Rome promised freedom at the end of 30 years, but that freedom was another kind of exile, another quiet punishment wrapped in silk. You had begun to suspect this already. You saw it in the older women who had stayed past their service, supervisors now, hollow-eyed sentinels patrolling the hallways like ghosts. They were not protectors. They were evidence, living warnings of what awaited you on the other side. You were 19 when the thoughts first began, the ones you never dared speak aloud. Was death kinder than decades of watching yourself disappear? Was burial truly the worst fate? Or was it release? Because by now you understood a terrible truth. There were two ways a Vestal could vanish: beneath the earth or inside her own mind. And some part of you, the part still capable of feeling, feared the latter more. You were 20 when you watched another Vestal beg the goddess for death. She wasn't weak. Her name was Domitia, and she had once been the strongest of you. Tall, proud, her voice like polished bronze in ritual. She'd endured everything with stoic grace. The silent punishments, the humiliating inspections, the midnight interrogations disguised as counsel. You had always believed she would survive all 30 years untouched. Maybe even leave with dignity, but no one leaves untouched. Not really. It started with whispers that Domitia had spoken too often to a temple guard, that their conversations lingered too long, that her eyes strayed when they shouldn't have. It didn't matter that nothing had happened. The truth, like so many things in Rome, was irrelevant. The accusation was enough. You were standing next to her when the senior Vestal stepped forward and spoke the words in that cold, ceremonial voice. The flame trembles. Vesta is displeased. The girl must answer. Domitia didn't speak. She only blinked once slowly, as if she had been expecting this, as if she'd always known it was coming for her. They took her away. You waited. All of you waited. Days passed. Then weeks, no news. No name spoken. The silence around her became heavier than any ritual chant. But then, late one night, you woke to a sound you would never forget. A scream. Not of pain, not of fear, but of rage. Domitia had returned. Her hair had been shaved. Her wrists were marked. Her mouth was bruised from the wax they used to silence her during judgment. They hadn't buried her. Not yet. That would require public ceremony. Instead, they had kept her in the lower chambers, isolated, broken, waiting for final approval from the College of Pontiffs to pronounce her sentence. She had been declared impure, but not yet dead. You saw her the next morning as they led her across the courtyard. Not like a criminal, like a beast, bound, guarded, head lowered. She caught your eye just for a moment, and what you saw there was not fear. It was hatred. It burned through her like wildfire, not toward the priests or the temple or even the gods. It was directed at you, all of you who had watched, who had stayed silent, who had let it happen. That night she tried to end it herself. She found a shard of glass near the washing basins, cut deep, not for attention but for escape. A clean line across the wrist, but she failed. And Rome punished failure even in death. They stitched her wounds without mercy, stripped her again, paraded her before the younger girls as a lesson. Not a soul cried. Not a word was spoken. You felt something die in you watching it. Not sympathy, not sorrow. Something worse. Recognition. You realized you weren't watching Domitia's fate. You were watching your future. The silence after that moment never left your chest. You walked differently. You blinked slower. You stopped asking questions even in your mind. You let the fear calcify into something harder, numbness. You began to lose time. Sometimes you would find yourself sitting by the flame with no memory of how long you had been there. Minutes, hours? You forgot entire prayers mid-sentence. You began to forget your own name before the temple. And still the rituals continued, beautiful and cruel as ever. The citizens who saw you in the forum whispered about your grace, your discipline, your purity. They saw a saint you felt like a tomb, and worst of all, you started to prefer it, not because it was safe, but because it was predictable. The temple was a prison of rituals, but it was also the only place you knew how to exist. You had forgotten softness, forgotten your mother's voice. Forgotten what it felt like to be held. You were not waiting for freedom. You were waiting for nothing, and Rome called it devotion. When the 30th year crept near, you did not feel anticipation. You did not feel relief. You felt nothing, or rather, you felt something worse than fear, the dull, heavy knowledge that there was nothing left of you to free. But Rome pretended. They spoke of release as if it were a rebirth. They told you about dowries, pensions, the right to marry, the right to live as other women lived. The word they used was liberation, yet even the way they said it sounded hollow, like a promise carved into smoke. The ceremony of release was small, private, unbearably gentle. Hands that once lectured and punished now touched you with artificial reverence. Senior priestesses placed a wreath on your head and told you your service was complete, your debt to Rome paid. You stood there, still as marble, while they pretended this moment was triumph. Then the temple gates opened for you, not to escort you to burial, but to send you into a world you no longer knew how to walk through. You stepped outside, and for the first time in 30 years, there was no guard behind you. No priest watching, no senior Vestal measuring your expression. Just daylight and noise and motion, a city alive in ways you had forgotten human life could be. The sun didn't feel warm. It felt foreign. Men watched you pass, not out of desire but with wary fascination, like you were a relic, not a woman. You heard one whisper to another, "That one is finished. Return to the world." Strange creatures, the Vestals. You were no longer sacred, but you were not ordinary either. You were something in between, too holy to touch, too ruined to marry. Rumors spread faster than breath. Some men feared marrying a former Vestal would bring divine punishment. Others whispered that 30 years of celibacy had made your body unnatural. A few, darker still, believed any woman who lived that long without a man must be cursed or secretly unclean. Suitors did not come. Doors did not open. No one welcomed you home because you no longer had a home. Your family? They were strangers now. Your parents were dead. Your brothers grown old with wives and children you had never met. When you visited them, their smiles were polite, not warm. You were treated like a guest. Like a relic stored too long in a temple vault, unfamiliar and slightly frightening. You tried to sit with them at supper, but the noise of ordinary laughter rattled your nerves. People passed objects hand to hand, too casually, and you flinched every time, expecting correction. You did not know how to speak without formality, how to rest without ritual, how to live without waiting for judgment. The world expected you to be grateful, but you felt like a statue pulled off its pedestal, no longer admired, but also never allowed to be just human. Some nights, you woke in a panic, certain the flame was dying. You would leap to your feet, heart racing, only to remember there was no flame, no temple, no duty, only silence. Freedom was not freedom, it was absence. And absence is its own kind of cage. You met other former Vestals sometimes, passing them in markets or seeing them seated alone in shaded courtyards. They never smiled first. Their hands trembled the same way yours did. One wore her veil still, even though she no longer had to, because she didn't know how to exist without it. Another lived alone on the edge of the city, locking her doors and lighting lamps in ritual patterns no one understood but her. Not one of them looked healed. Not one of them looked whole. Rome claimed you were honored for your service. But you knew the truth. Rome honored what you represented, not what you were. They had taken your body when you were a child. They had taken your body when you were a child. They had taken your voice before it had grown. They had taken your name, your mother, your youth, your agency, yourself. And when everything human had been burned out of you, they called you free. Freedom was not a gift. It was an aftertaste, and Rome knew it, because a woman who no longer knows how to live is never a threat. You did not realize how deeply Rome had hollowed you until years after your release, when you found yourself standing before a fountain, watching the water ripple, and suddenly understanding that you did not know how to feel wonder anymore. You were not angry. You were not hopeful. You were not grieving. You were simply absent inside yourself. Rome hadn't just guarded your body, it had replaced your inner world with silence. That was the final theft. No rods, no burial, no chamber beneath the earth, just a slow erasure of the woman you might have become. This was Rome's genius. They did not need to kill a Vestal to destroy her. They only needed time. Those who did not die beneath the soil died in different ways, out in the sunlight where no one had to witness the collapse. Rome let the world believe that the Vestals were honored guardians of the empire. But the truth was simpler and darker. They were warnings, living monuments to obedience, examples carved from children, proof of what Rome could take and keep. Rome taught itself to call cruelty sacred, so it never had to feel shame. In the evenings, you sometimes lit a small oil lamp in your home, not out of devotion, but out of compulsion. Your hands moved the same way they had in the temple. Your body bent in the same quiet prayer. Ritual had become muscle. Fear had become marrow. Obedience had become identity. This was what 30 years had purchased. Sometimes in passing, people still bowed their heads to you. Not out of admiration, but out of distance. You were not a survivor to them. You were a symbol, emptied of self so thoroughly that your humanity was now indistinguishable from myth. And yet, the cruelest truth of all was this. No one remembered you as a child stolen from a courtyard. No one remembered the mother's scream. No one remembered the girl behind the vow. They remembered only the vessel. Rome had taken everything, and then convinced the world it was holy. The flame you guarded all those decades still burned. The rituals continued. New girls were chosen just as you were. Small hands trembling beneath the gaze of the pontifex, mothers collapsing in helpless grief, fathers standing in brittle silence. Another name erased, another childhood sealed. The cycle never broke. Not because Rome needed purity, but because Rome needed control. One night, long after your hair had silvered, you dreamed of the day you were chosen. You did not see the temple. You did not see the marble. You saw only your mother's face in that first moment. Her eyes wide with terror, her voice broken by a cry she wasn't allowed to finish. And when you woke, you realized you had not thought of her face in years. It hit you not like memory, but like loss, because for all the suffering, all the silence, all the obedience, she was the only person who had ever mourned you. The others worshipped the symbol. Only she grieved the child, and that is when the truth finally came into focus. You had not been freed. You had only outlived your captivity. The world called you pure. But purity was just another word for erased. Rome buried its Vestals twice, once beneath ritual, and again beneath history. And if they are remembered at all, it is never as daughters. Never as children, never as women aching to breathe. They are remembered as guardians of a flame. Not one soul asks what it cost them to keep it burning.